This video is brought to you by patreon.com/worsttake. Get access to exclusive live streams and Discord servers, on-screen shoutouts, and early access to some videos when you join now. Help make sure that we can continue to make content like this by supporting the Patreon. Links are in the description down below. Now, when this whole thing started, I think a lot of us, even the people who weren't necessarily the most excited about it, a lot of us felt like, hey, you're going to get at least 2 good games out of Joe Flacco, right? Because we all saw that he played his best in the Gary Kubiak system. We knew that Kevin Stefanski is a disciple of that Gary Kubiak system. Gary Kubiak, famously Kevin Stefanski's mentor, who he bases his whole steez after, is Gary Kubiak. And we knew that, hey, man, push come to shove, he can give you a couple games. But the worry for a lot of us who had worries, myself included, was how long can this last, right? Is what you get from Joe Flacco day one going to be the best that you get out of Joe Flacco in his whole run here? And then it's going to progressively go down and down and down as time goes on? Or does it have any potential to improve? And a lot of us felt like, even people who believe it or acting like they believed it the whole time, a lot of us felt like 38, man, is a very old age to be improving at football in the NFL. Doesn't happen very often. Well, Joe Flacco is not just defying time with his age, right? Because he's older. He's defying time because he's getting better right now than he has been in years past. Now, the reason I say this is by far, no doubt, to me, this Houston game, far, far, far better than any of his other games in Cleveland. And if this is what he looks like for the rest of the year, not what he looked like versus Chicago, Jacksonville, LA, which was flashes of brilliance, a lot of questionable stuff in between that. This was just brilliance. If this is what he can be for the rest of the season, the Browns can go very far with this. And if you don't believe me, just look at the QBR, right? His first game back, he had a 50 QBR despite having these big numbers. Then the second game back, he had a 33 QBR despite having those big numbers, because they factor into turnovers and the ball positioning into the QBR. And in his last game versus Chicago, despite the fact that he had that good fourth quarter, he had a 24 QBR. By far his worst game as a Cleveland Brown, despite the fact that he was able to dig himself out of the hole that he did create. There was none of that this week. And that's the most encouraging thing about this Joe Flacco performance, is because it took me from, okay, he's going to make some plays, he's going to make mistakes, it's going to be heavily on the defense in order to win any game that you play, which, let's be honest, the 2 games that they won, was heavy reliance on the defense. This one was like, hey, the defense showed up. The defense did its thing. For the most part, the starters didn't give up a single touchdown. The defense did its thing, no doubt. But this was a game won by the offense this week. And that's something that is very hard to come by in the NFL. It's something that's hard to come by for this Browns team, especially not having Nick Chubb, because it's one thing if you win a game on offense with a quarterback who's not your starter, because Nick Chubb goes off, right? That can happen with anybody. It's another thing when you go off on offense simply because your quarterback's playing brilliantly. And this is a game where I'm like, all interceptions aren't equal, right? The 3 interceptions he threw in Chicago are not equal to the 2 interceptions that he threw in this game. It's just not the same. Like, those interceptions just mattered less. They happened in less critical moments of the game, and they were less egregious this week than any of those other interceptions. So they just don't matter as much. And what I'm seeing is something that's kind of surprising me. It wouldn't surprise me if Joe Flacco were 28. It wouldn't surprise me if Joe Flacco were even like 32 or something like that. But it does surprise me because Joe Flacco is 38, and I thought that he had known as much as there is to know out of a Gary Kubiak style offense as he knew day one when he joined the Cleveland Browns. Well, 4 weeks into this, and he is looking like he is not just getting a mastery of the offense, but he's getting a mastery of the personnel. And that's something that I think whenever Deshaun gets back, which he looks like he's on track to play next year, he needs to take note of everything that's going on right now. Because I don't know if Joe Flacco is going to play next year. I'm going to be honest with you, could care less about next year right now. We are in December. The Browns have 2 more very important games to play. They also have like playoff football to worry about, right? Like they got to clinch it and everything else is kind of a formality with them at 10 wins, but they have all of those things to worry about ahead of them in the future. I just don't care about the Flacco Watson wars. That'll resolve itself out by May, right? Like we'll be wherever we are with that. People will be salty or happy with whatever happens with that. And then we'll be right on doing the same shit, talking about the Browns in May. I just find that spending energy when the team is winning like this on something like that is pointless, right? I don't get paychecks and then laugh at people who are broke because I got paid. And I feel like it's kind of that energy right now where it's like, oh, people are like, Joe Flacco balls out and then we make it about somebody else. Just be happy that Joe Flacco balling out, right? So Joe Flacco legitimately balling out. And if he continues to play like this, and given the fact that people have kind of given him a pass on some of these other games that he's had, that, you look at the QBR, it's not very impressive. But if he continues to play like this and he finishes the regular season like this, I'm going to sit here and I'm going to make the argument that Joe Flacco should be comeback player of the year. The reason I think Joe Flacco should be comeback player of the year is simple. Who has come back from more than Joe Flacco? Because the other argument I've seen out there that I do think is a good argument is Baker Mayfield, actually. A lot of people putting out there, Baker Mayfield should be comeback player of the year. It's a guy who had one of the worst 2022s, 2021, 2 straight bad years. And he is a candidate to win comeback player of the year without getting injured, similar to Joe Flacco. The reason I will put Joe Flacco over Baker Mayfield, despite Baker doing this for a season versus Joe Flacco only being asked to do it for maybe 6 games in the regular season, is Joe Flacco is fighting 10 more years of age than Baker Mayfield. Like, what makes this incredible, what Joe Flacco is doing, is not the numbers or the raw numbers of it all, right? Because yes, 1,300 yards, 10 touchdowns, 7 interceptions is impressive. But what makes this super impressive is that he is 38 years old and he didn't have a warm up, right? Like he came from off the couch to doing this in the NFL. That's what I think makes it super impressive. And I think that's what makes it very impressive to a lot of people. Whereas Baker Mayfield, still in his athletic prime, got put in a good situation with Mike Evans, and he's balling out because of that, and good on Bake. But I still think Joe Flacco probably should get the comeback player of the year award over him. Now, Baker Mayfield's not Joe Flacco's biggest hurdle for comeback player of the year. Joe Flacco's biggest hurdle for comeback player of the year is Demar Hamlin, and this touches on a very interesting subject that I'm going to try to handle very delicately because it has to do with Demar Hamlin. Now, if you've watched Q and Cole, you would know that I am not a fan of how Demar Hamlin has been treated and how his career is kind of being sacrificed in order to fulfill a narrative that people want to be fulfilled, to feel better about what happened that day in Cincinnati. A lot of the conversation about Demar Hamlin is basically people trying to make themselves feel better about the fact that they love and consume and their whole livelihood is wrapped up in a sport that almost killed a man on a very mundane play. And while that is a hard thing for everybody to wrap around, including myself, who I also make my money talking about this sport, I don't think what they're doing to him, which I believe a lot of people are doing out of some feeling of kindness towards Demar, I think it's not done with enough empathy to actually have the intended impact for Demar Hamlin. Like, I think a lot of the empathy, with a lot of the sympathy and the sympathetic things that people are doing to symbolize that they are empathetic towards Demar don't actually help him. Case in point, giving him comeback player of the year just cause, right? Just because they feel like it's the right thing to do. And I think this kind of like makes it seem like Demar Hamlin's not an active player. Like, this would be one thing if Demar got paralyzed or something, or he was never able to have that agency over his own career again. But that's just not the case. Like, he does have the agency to fulfill whatever expectations people had of him in his career. Luckily, he got out of that whole thing pretty unscathed. Like, he was able to recover. He made a full recovery. He's able to play football again. He's able to get back on the football field. And that's all great. But it doesn't feel like that, right? Like, it feels like he gets treated like Ryan Shazier. It feels like people are taking his own agency out of this. Like, as much as people have assumed that Demar Hamlin should be comeback player of the year, has anybody cared to even ask Demar Hamlin if that's a gesture he would appreciate? That's a serious ass question. Like, for real, for all the people who are going to tell me because I say, I don't think you should give Demar Hamlin comeback player of the year simply because he survived that ordeal against Cincinnati. I think a lot of people who are going to call me an asshole for pointing it out, ask those same people who are calling me an asshole, hey man, what do you think Demar Hamlin thinks about this? Have you heard a quote about what Demar Hamlin thinks about this? Have you asked Demar Hamlin if this is a gesture he would appreciate? Because if somebody were doing something for me, I sure as hell would want to know if it's something I appreciate. Nobody's even thought to ask him. Seriously, all these interviews, all this, nobody has gone to this man for a quote. Nobody has gone to this man to ask how he feels. And again, this is what I go back to with the whole Demar Hamlin thing. It feels like people have taken his agency as a person out of it because it's not about the person Demar Hamlin. It's about how we want to feel about Demar Hamlin. Because if we cared about how Demar Hamlin felt and we cared about giving him this gesture and making him feel good, we would know how he feels about this gesture that everybody's just assuming that the league should do for him. We would really know how he feels about that if we actually cared about how Demar Hamlin feels. But we don't. And that's the thing that disturbs me about this whole thing, is that Demar Hamlin has kind of been made into a symbol when he's an actual person. And it's danger in doing that. And I would fear if you give him comeback player of the year for this, it's different than Alex Smith, where Alex Smith got hurt in a violent football play and then came back and played football, and he was already a notable player in the league before all of this happened. Demar Hamlin, on the other hand, is only known for almost dying. And if you give him comeback player of the year for this, you're making it so that he will always only be known exclusively, no matter what he does, for being the dude who died. And think about that. Think about how traumatic of a day that could have been for anybody who experienced it. And think about that being the one thing that everybody's going to define you as for the rest of your life. And ask yourself if you want an award to cement that. I'm not saying how he should feel about it, but I am offering a counter to it saying, hey, we don't know how he feels because nobody has asked, because none of this shit is actually about Demar Hamlin. It's about how everybody wants you to feel about it. And that's the big issue in it. So my philosophical problem with people just wanting to blindly award this thing to a guy who, as a gesture, without even asking the guy if that gesture would be appreciated or not, that whole thing aside, this is an award that should be defined by what you do on the field. And these things start to matter less and less when you make how you get it about how people feel about you off the field. MVP should go to the most spectacular player in the NFL, not the player that you like the most that had the best year. If Dak's the best player in the NFL, you got to give it to Dak. If Lamar's the best player in the NFL, but he told you to F off, you got to give it to Lamar. That's how we know these awards mean something, because if it just becomes who you like, then it just becomes the buddy club and nobody cares about those awards. There has to be something tangible about who these awards are given to. And if you just give them to somebody because you feel like it, you don't only do a disservice to the person that you're doing the gesture to, but you potentially do a disservice to anybody who might win that award in the future. So while I understand it's super popular to give this award and make it a sympathy thing for Demar Hamlin, first thing I want to know, has anybody asked Demar Hamlin about this? Like, I'm dead serious. If somebody has and he said, hey, I want that award, okay, cool, give him the award. I have no issues with that. I'm not going to fight for Joe Flacco getting that award. If it's a gesture he would appreciate it. That's where he's at with his life. Okay, cool. But if that's not where he's at, or he's not talked about it, then we really shouldn't be doing shit like assuming that's what he wants and just giving him it because of that, because he might be a competitor still, right? Like, he might want to earn any award that he's given. He might want to look at the mantelpiece and see something that he did as an athlete, not something that he survived. But that's just something to think about, man. Because all this talk about DeMar definitely getting comeback player of the year, I haven't heard a single person ask DeMar about winning comeback player of the year. And I know the comment section is going to be full of that. Hey, DeMar's going to win it. DeMar's going to win it. But I'm trying to challenge that thought process. Is this comeback player of the year, or should this comeback player of the year be decided on how we feel versus what's on the field and what's actually better for everybody involved if we go about it? Seriously, challenge yourself there. Instead of just saying what you think the media is going to do with it, challenge that thought. And then also ask yourself, what does Demar Hamlin think about all this? Because of all the voices about Demar Hamlin that have been screaming and yelling and trying to push this or that or whatever agenda that people are trying to push about Demar Hamlin, the quietest voice, the least promoted voice in this whole thing has actually been Demar Hamlin. And I don't know about y'all. If something that traumatic happened to me, I wouldn't want other people speaking on my behalf louder than I can speak on my behalf. And I would just like for people to slow down a second and ask them that. I do think if they decide to go a different way, Joe Flacco should be the comeback player of the year as long as he continues to play like he's been, because he embodies what comeback player of the year is. Secondly, would probably be Baker Mayfield. There's probably somebody I'm forgetting, but I think that's how that whole thing should go. I know I went the long way, and I know this was a video that encompassed a lot more topics than just the Browns here, but, you know, follow along with me on this. But thank you guys for watching this video. Y'all have a great day. Have an even better night. Peace.